In a packed congressional hearing streamed across 7 platforms to over 17 million viewers, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts MSNBC host Nicolle Wallace over a chilling accusation, using a traumatized 12-year-old survivor, DJ Daniel, as political bait. Wallace defends herself under the bright Capitol lights, preaching journalistic integrity, until Jasmine plays a 2-minute unreleased clip that stops the room cold. A voice laughs off the boy's pain, a whisper becomes a weapon, and the balance of power flips. With reputations crumbling and a nation watching, one question explodes across every screen. What happens when the voice trusted to tell the truth is the one that buried it? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. 10 a.m. Capitol Hill was under siege. Not by protesters, not by legislation, but by truth sharpening its blade. Inside room 416 of the Rayburn House office building, the air buzzed with a voltage that only comes when millions are watching. Live. Seated beneath the white-hot spotlight was Nicolle Wallace, dressed in a steel gray blazer, hair perfectly waved, face powdered into perfection. But no layer of foundation could mask the tremor in her left hand. She gripped the table edge, not in poise, but survival. Behind the gloss of a seasoned media icon was a woman surrounded by doubt and accusation, seconds from becoming the story instead of shaping it. Suddenly, the chamber doors creaked open, not dramatically, but decisively. Jasmine Crockett entered like a judgment made flesh, her heels silent, her presence deafening. She wore midnight black with a crimson pin, subtle but surgical. Her eyes never once turned toward Wallace. She did not nod. She did not pause. She crossed the marble floor with the precision of a closing verdict and placed a single object before her on the polished wood, a 5-centimeter thick black dossier, tabbed in matte red with a single word burned into its cover. Expose, not a file, a fuse. Members of the committee leaned in, cameras refocused. Wallace's fingers twitched near her water glass, but she didn't drink. She couldn't. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The folder alone had already changed the temperature of the room, and outside, across America, 17 million viewers sat forward in their chairs, hearts racing, waiting for the first incision. And just as the silence from the expose folder began suffocating the air, Nicolle Wallace drew in a shallow breath, adjusted her mic with a calculated grace, and leaned forward. The room, though still, felt like it was bracing for impact. Cameras panned closer. The viewers, now over 18 million, watched, not blinking. She began speaking with the smooth cadence of a media veteran, her voice steady, polished, and dressed in righteous conviction. In the face of rising authoritarianism, she declared, her gaze sweeping across the committee, a free press is not a luxury. It is the final line of defense. Her words struck the microphones with a tone that demanded reverence, as though they were etched into marble the moment they left her lips. She held each sentence with deliberate pause, letting them hang in the air like banners of self-sacrifice. I have dedicated my career to truth, she continued, eyes softening just enough to feign vulnerability, even when it was unpopular, even when it was uncomfortable. The room didn't move. She nodded once, slow and solemn. We do not need protection from hard truths. We need the courage to face them. A few murmurs of agreement whispered through the gallery. Somewhere in the back, a producer scribbled notes, perhaps thinking this could be salvaged. But Jasmine Crockett remained stone still, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't interrupt. She didn't interject. She simply waited until the final syllable of Wallace's speech was drowned by its own echo. Then, without looking up, Jasmine tapped the screen before her with a single finger. One soundless motion. The LED screen behind the witness table flickered, then burst to life. It wasn't dramatized. It wasn't cut with soundtracks or graphics. What played was raw footage, time-stamped, direct from the MSNBC vault. Nicolle Wallace's voice emerged again, but stripped of performance, stripped of intent. It wasn't the polished op-ed style she had just delivered. It was colder, cleaner, more lethal. If this boy, DJ Daniel, ends up like so many officers who took their lives after January 6th. Who's going to tell that story? The words landed like a punch through glass. Audible gasps rippled across the chamber. One of the stenographers dropped her pen. A senior Republican leaned forward, lips parting in disbelief. The room was not just stunned, it was wounded. In 30 seconds, the entire illusion of principled journalism, of noble intent, began to unravel like thread from the hem of a decaying flag. And still, Jasmine said nothing. She waited until the clip ended. No transitions, no fade to black. Just the blunt termination of a voice that had, for years, framed national conversations. Then Jasmine leaned in, voice sharp and calm, slicing through the silence like a scalpel to infected skin. They call that commentary. They called it insight. I call it what it is, an assassination of a child's dignity. No dramatics, no raised tone, just surgical precision. You took a boy fighting cancer and used him as a cautionary tale for chaos he never caused. Wallace didn't speak. Her eyes flickered, but not with denial, with the weight of something darker, realization. This wasn't journalism, it was projection with a body count. No one moved, not the staffers, not the press. The cameras kept rolling, capturing not just a moment, but an unraveling. And as Jasmine leaned back into her chair, folder unopened, Wallace's opening speech already belonged to another timeline, a version of history that no longer held power in this room. And just when the tension in the room felt like it had reached its peak, when the air itself seemed to cling to Jasmine Crockett's final devastating words about dignity and distortion, something shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. Jasmine turned, just slightly, toward the court technician seated at the console, and with a voice that felt colder than the marble beneath their feet, said, "Play Exhibit 12. The lights didn't dim this time. They didn't need to. What followed wasn't visual. It was a sound, a voice, a truth stripped bare of any script, lighting, or spin. A low static crackled through the overhead speakers for half a second. Then came the audio, clean, recorded in a production meeting, time-stamped and verified. "Put his name in the segment?" Nicolle Wallace's voice said, relaxed, amused. Then she laughed. Software-controlled, but unmistakable. The laugh of someone who didn't think anyone else would ever hear it. And then the second sentence fell, like a brick through glass. "Not because he's special, but because the reaction will be." The moment the sentence ended, a jarring beep sounded across the speakers, an FCC standard censor tone. But it was too late. Whatever that final word was, whatever context the editors tried to conceal, its absence only sharpened the cruelty of what remained. The reaction wasn't immediate. It was delayed, like shock before the pain. No one screamed, no one stood. But faces changed. Postures stiffened. Aides stopped typing. Reporters stopped scribbling. Every camera operator instinctively zoomed closer to Wallace's face, hoping for even the smallest crack in the mask. She sat frozen, eyes locked forward, lips pressed in a tight, bloodless line. Her shoulders rose and fell in short, shallow bursts. The flush of embarrassment had long passed. What remained was the pallor of exposure, and not the kind she was used to behind anchor desks and strategic narratives. This was the exposure of motive, of calculation laid bare, the kind no retraction could retract. In that moment, Nicolle Wallace wasn't a respected journalist. She wasn't a political analyst. She wasn't even a defendant. She was something far more dangerous, a figure who had used her platform not for illumination, but for manipulation. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't gloat. That would have cheapened the moment. Instead, she remained perfectly still, allowing the silence to do what words could never accomplish. Letting it breathe, letting it linger, letting every soul in that chamber sit with the realization that what had once been dismissed as just media had in fact been methodically engineered impact. And that impact had a name, DJ Daniel, a child, a cancer survivor, a symbol turned into a soundbite, a boy whose suffering was calculated as effective content. The room sat with that knowledge, swallowed it, choked on it, And just when it seemed like the silence might finally break into outrage or defense, a voice, barely audible but sharp as broken glass, sliced through the quiet. She just buried her own career. The words came from the third row. Representative Linda McGraw, Republican of Tennessee. She wasn't speaking to the floor. She wasn't grandstanding. She thought she was whispering. But the microphone at her desk, sensitive and live, picked it up just enough to be caught by the chamber's closed caption stream and splashed across the bottom of every broadcast in real time. And handed Crockett the shovel. Gasps followed, not from the audacity of the comment, but from its brutal accuracy. And as the last echoes of Wallace's recorded voice faded, leaving behind the scorched wreckage of her intent laid bare, Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't turn toward the cameras, nor did she bask in the tidal shift of momentum crashing silently in her favor. Instead, she leaned forward with the patience of someone holding one final match over a house soaked in gasoline. She pressed a small, discreet remote next to her files, and the LED screen behind her changed once more. No flare, no warning. Just a hard cut to a grainy, shadowed figure seated in a sterile room. Their face was obscured with deep pixelation, their voice distorted into a metallic monotone. But the truth that followed couldn't be softened, not by filters, not by darkness. "My name and location have been redacted for safety," the voice began, each word steady but heavy. "I served as an audio engineer on Deadline with Nicolle Wallace for 3.5 years. A few heads in the gallery turned sharply, others leaned in. The masked figure continued without pause. "My job was to manage live feeds, segment transitions, and audio cues. But somewhere along the way, that job changed. It stopped being about clarity and started being about strategy." There was a pause, no edits, no cuts, just silence, real and rotting. "Wallace and her producers developed what they called the destruction list," the voice said flatly. "It was a database of keywords, phrases, and tonal indicators, flagged to be layered beneath certain subjects or guests, not for accuracy, but for effect. You could feel the blood leave the room. Some leaned back, others leaned forward, but no one stayed neutral. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She didn't need to press the moment. The witness was doing that for her. Words like volatile, unhinged, or dangerously naive were repeatedly attached to conservative guests. We were instructed to turn down their mics by 6%, just enough to affect presence, but not enough to trigger complaints. A Democratic aide covered their mouth. Another began typing frantically on their tablet. Black officials and speakers were often framed with phrases like overly emotional or outlier representation, veterans critical of policy, fractured or politically confused, and children, particularly those seen as symbols against progressive narratives, tokenized, or worse, statistical anomalies. That's what we called DJ Daniel behind the scenes. A loud murmur swept through the committee floor. Wallace remained motionless, but her eyes dropped, not to her notes, not to her counsel, but to the space between her hands, which now gripped each other as if trying to hold back the weight of collapse. "These weren't accidents," the voice pressed on. "They were approved scripts, embedded signals, designed to guide viewers' emotions without their conscious awareness." The feed ended abruptly. No thank you, no fade out. Just black, stark, final. And into that brutal vacuum, a voice broke. This one unfiltered, unprepared. It came from the riser near the north wall, where press outlets had been packed elbow to elbow since dawn. A CNN correspondent, still wearing her press badge and earpiece, forgot, just for a moment, that her mic was live. "This isn't an inquiry anymore," she whispered, almost breathless. "This is a dissection of media ethics." The room didn't applaud. It didn't gasp. It froze, because nothing else needed to be said. That sentence hung in the air like a guillotine cable, half cut, half weighted, waiting for gravity. And at the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, unblinking. And across from her sat Nicolle Wallace, no longer a media figure, just a silhouette beneath the surgical light. And just as the last words from the whistleblower faded into an unforgiving silence, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic. Not out of habit, but like someone preparing to light the final fuse. Her eyes remained locked on the screen as she spoke, low and unwavering. Exhibit 14, Psychological Autopsy, Officer Marcus L. Halden. The words fell heavy, sterile, and precise. The screen came alive, not with footage this time, but with a document. Stark white, black text, federal letterhead. At the top, bolded, Forensic Psychological Evaluation. Case closed. Suicide by carbon monoxide. April 14th, 2022. The document scrolled slowly, no music, no voiceover, just the brutal cadence of truth laid out line by line. Then the screen froze on a single line, highlighted in glaring yellow. Subject referenced MSNBC segment aired same day. Program, deadline with Nicolle Wallace as triggering content. Jasmine paused, then tapped the screen again. This time, a clip began to play. Archived, unedited, from the deadline broadcast dated April 14th, 2022. Nicolle Wallace was mid-panel, surrounded by analysts, each nodding in sync. The topic, police response during a neighborhood mental health call in Denver. Officer Marcus Halden's body cam footage had surfaced earlier that week, not for misconduct, but simply for review. In the footage, he remained calm, gave repeated verbal de-escalation warnings, and ultimately made no arrest. Yet on air, Wallace offered no such context. "Here's what I see," Wallace said, eyes locked on the screen, voice dripping with clinical disdain. "A man too quick to reach for control and too slow to recognize humanity. It's a textbook case of systemic fear masquerading as authority." The other panelists murmured in agreement. "How many more of these heroes are we going to let define what protection means?" She continued. "It's trauma dressed in a badge." The words weren't shouted. They were delivered calmly, surgically. There was no evidence of misconduct, no formal complaint against Halden, no violent action taken during the encounter. Yet Deadline framed him as a poster child for embedded police dysfunction, using terms like emotionally rigid, hypervigilant, and morally desensitized. His image had been replayed on a loop over moody filters, while Wallace's voiceover casts a psychological verdict. "We need to talk about the officers who pass all the tests, because the rot doesn't always look angry. Sometimes it looks calm." The video stopped. Static silence followed. Jasmine spoke again, voice low and stripped of all courtroom theater. "He served 19 years, 3 precincts, no complaints, 83 de-escalated incidents, 4 commendations, but he was reduced in 7.5 minutes to a cautionary tale." She turned a page in her binder, as if slicing through the air. 3 hours after this segment aired, Officer Marcus Halden pulled into his garage, turned on his car, and never left it again. A choked breath escaped somewhere in the gallery. A staffer dropped their pen. The sentence had detonated quietly, but the damage rippled like shock waves beneath the skin. Wallace didn't move. Her posture held, but it was brittle now, as though the slightest noise might fracture it completely. Then the screen shifted again. Jasmine raised a single sheet of paper, age slightly creased, a thumb smudge near the bottom edge. She held it with both hands. "This arrived in my office 2 months later," she said. "It wasn't written by a lawyer. It wasn't filed with any agenda. It was grief, folded into an envelope, and sent by a woman who had just lost everything." Jasmine didn't look at Wallace when she read it. She looked straight ahead. "When Mrs. Wallace speaks, millions believe her, and that belief killed my husband." The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unbearable. It pressed down on every chest in the room like judgment made manifest, a weight that couldn't be shifted or shared. Jasmine let the letter drop slowly to the table, still open. She didn't say another word. Wallace's eyes dropped, not in surrender but in something darker. Her hand reached out instinctively for the water bottle on the table. Her fingers grasped the cap, but the tension in her wrist betrayed her. The cap slipped. The bottle shifted. She caught it with her other hand, just in time to stop it from falling, but not in time to stop the shaking. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The woman who once commanded primetime narrative now sat visibly unraveling, silenced by the very gravity she had once wielded without restraint. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The evidence was still glowing on the screen. The letter still trembled on the desk. And Officer Marcus Halden's voice, though never heard, had finally spoken. And just as the weight of Officer Halden's story settled into the marrow of every person in the room, his letter still splayed open like an open wound. Jasmine Crockett didn't pause to let the audience recover. She knew recovery wasn't the point. Truth didn't wait. Justice didn't soften. It moved forward like a scalpel, one incision at a time. She turned a page in her binder, slow, deliberate, then looked back up. Her voice, when it came, was colder now, almost forensic. "We've heard how words can kill," she said. "Now let's examine what bought those words." A ripple passed through the gallery. Jasmine pressed a button on her tablet, and the screen behind her flickered to life once more. This time it wasn't a clip, nor a photo, nor a letter. It was a wire transfer confirmation, stark, digital, real. The words at the top of the document read, "Transfer receipt, Civic Source Initiative LLC to Waverly Gate Media Holdings, April 17th, 2022. Below that, amount $600,000, 00 USD memo line. Content expansion, pre-launch, TBP. The initials were unmistakable. TBP, The Best People, Nicolle Wallace's flagship podcast project, announced only days after the DJ Daniel broadcast had gone viral. Jasmine let the numbers sit there, glowing under the soft lights like blood under an ultraviolet scan. "This," she said slowly, "was deposited 3 days after Wallace's nationally televised segment about DJ Daniel, a child fighting brain cancer who by then had become a political lightning rod. Not because he wanted to, but because someone saw value in making him one." She tapped her screen again. The wire receipt was replaced by an email. The header read, "Subject, Narrative Leverage, Reaction Metrics. Post 5, 1-4 segment." The date matched the wire. The sender, a strategic advisor from the Civic Source Initiative. The recipient, an executive from Wallace's media production partner. No names had been redacted. Jasmine had made sure of that. And then, in the body of the email, highlighted in yellow, just one sentence. A sentence that no spin, no press team, no pre-written apology could explain away. "If Wallace still has shock power, tell her to target something sacred to the other side." A symbol. That boy is perfect. The oxygen in the room disappeared. There were no gasps this time, no outbursts, just stillness, pure graveyard stillness. It wasn't just the content of the sentence. It was its precision, the chilling awareness. The coldness of that boy is perfect. As if DJ Daniel were a thumbnail, a data point, a PR move instead of a living, breathing child with a port in his chest and hospital wristbands still collecting on his nightstand. This wasn't just editorial recklessness. It was market-tested cruelty, and it had been bankrolled. $600,000 worth. Jasmine didn't speak for a moment. She let the words hang, corrosive and undeniable, before continuing in a tone stripped of everything but truth. This wasn't about outrage. It wasn't about telling hard stories. It was about triggering maximum engagement, high emotion, high shareability. Because pain sells, and DJ Daniel was seen not as a boy, but as bait. She turned to the committee, and that transaction, backed by a political influence network, routed through shell media groups, buried under layers of consulting firms, was made to support a podcast that hadn't even aired an episode yet, but the script had already been written. The message had already been paid for. Jasmine paused again and looked down briefly, then back up, eyes razor sharp. "It is important to say for the record that The Best People was never marketed as political," she continued. "It was branded as a human interest series, a conversation podcast, a place, quote, where truth meets kindness." That was their slogan, where truth meets kindness. The chamber exhaled, but it was the breath of disbelief, the kind of breath one takes when watching a mask finally fall away. Then the cameras moved, not fast, not intrusive, but deliberately. They rotated slowly until they centered once more on Nicolle Wallace's face. The same face that had once commanded Sunday panels, morning briefings, primetime specials. But now that face had changed. It wasn't simply pale, it was ashen. Her lips were parted slightly, caught somewhere between confusion and collapse. Her eyes didn't rise to the screen, nor to Jasmine. They flicked between her water bottle, her lap, and the blank surface of the desk, as if any one of them might offer a way out. But there was no way out. Her right hand reached instinctively toward her papers. Her fingers touched the corner, then withdrew. Not in hesitation, but in retreat. Her composure had become a thin film, visible but no longer intact. The woman who had once owned the narrative was now a passenger inside someone else's. One she hadn't written, one she couldn't spin. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She didn't reach for the mic, because there was nothing left to say. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't smirk. She simply folded her hands in front of her and said the quiet part out loud. You weren't reporting, Mrs. Wallace. You were executing a business model with a child in the crosshairs. And with that, the transfer, the email, and the mask were all officially documented, under oath, on screen, and across every platform in America. And as the damning financial records faded from the screen, $600,000 tied directly to a child suffering, his name turned into profit. No one in the room moved. There was no gasping now, no scribbled notes, no hurried whispers. Only a collective stillness, as if the entire chamber was holding its breath for a verdict no court would need to pronounce. Jasmine Crockett didn't reach for more files. She didn't call another witness. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes fixed on the space between her and Nicolle Wallace. Not looking at her, but through the architecture of power that had allowed this moment to exist in the first place. The weight of the evidence behind her, the eyes of a nation ahead. And then, finally, she spoke. Not like a politician, but like a woman with nothing left to prove. When someone with a microphone, Jasmine began, her voice low, steady, and slow like thunder gathering over a battlefield, uses a child, not to protect them, not to uplift them, but to harvest emotion and clicks, then journalism is no longer under threat from government censorship. Her words carved their way through the silence, each one building upon the next with deadly precision. It's not a politician muzzling the press. It's not a dictator burning books. It's something colder. She sat up straighter, her fingers laced in front of her, knuckles white. It's betrayal, and it doesn't come from the outside. A pause, brief but blinding. It comes from the person holding the mic. The statement cracked through the room like a whip, and yet it wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words landed heavier because they came without fury, only clarity. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but everything else in the room seemed to fall. The illusion of moral high ground, the echo of media immunity, the myth that power cloaked in concern couldn't still be power weaponized. Jasmine held the gaze of the audience, of the lawmakers, of every screen still tuned in. She let the silence that followed speak just as loudly as her statement. She had peeled away the final defense, that the press, no matter how flawed, was somehow untouchable, that noble intention could mask intentional harm. But in that moment, there was no refuge left in mission statements or press credentials, because the truth was undeniable now. The story hadn't just been told, it had been sold, and a child had paid the price. And as Jasmine Crockett's final words settled like ash on a battlefield, it comes from the person holding the mic. The silence that followed wasn't just contemplative, it was surgical. No one moved. No one reached for a pen. Even the committee stenographer paused, hands hovering over the keyboard like they were afraid to puncture the air. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She turned slightly. No dramatics, no smirk, just cold, procedural force, and tapped her screen again. The chamber lights dimmed, not by design, but because the power of what came next seemed to absorb the room's breath. The screen behind her flickered to life again, this time not with testimony, not with transfer receipts, but with data, stark, clinical, unarguable. A digital line graph bloomed into view, plotted with timestamps and viewer metrics. The y-axis labeled engagement per minute, the x-axis labeled episode timeline, the best people. And there it was, a spike so steep it looked like a fault line tearing through the earth, dated April 15th, 2022. Three words glowed beside it: DJ Daniel's segment, plus 422%. Jasmine didn't narrate it. She didn't need to. The numbers spoke in a language even the most loyal media defenders couldn't spin. One moment, one child, and a fourfold increase in interaction: shares, comments, downloads, ad reach. The monetization of trauma made manifest in pixels and precision. A boy with cancer turned into a commodity. No debate, no ambiguity, just math. The room remained paralyzed. But then the screen shifted again. No warning, no intro, no title card, just a video feed. A boy appeared. The boy, DJ Daniel. He was seated on a plain couch, a pillow tucked behind his lower back, a soft nasal cannula still fitted gently around his ears. His hair had thinned since the last public photo. The room was dim but warm. His mother could be seen in the background, standing silently by the hallway, arms crossed over her chest. The camera angle didn't wobble. The audio was crisp. It had been pre-recorded. But no one in that hearing room knew it was coming. And no one was ready for what he said. DJ looked straight into the lens. His eyes were tired but steady. His hands were folded in his lap. He spoke not like a victim, not like a symbol, but like a boy who had been forced to grow up faster than anyone ever should. "I don't really know what Miss Wallace was thinking," he said softly, "but I know what I was feeling." He paused. The silence that followed was louder than applause. "I was scared. I was confused. I didn't know how my name got on the news or why people were talking about me like I was going to die soon." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I'm trying to get better, that's all. I didn't ask to be on anyone's side. I didn't ask to be a message." And then he said it. "Please, just don't use my name to get attention. Don't use me for that. Please." That word, please, didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like a child begging not for pity, but for permission to be invisible again, to be just a kid, not a weapon, not a warning, just DJ. The screen froze on his face, not edited, not captioned, just still. The silence afterward was absolute, a silence that didn't ask for reaction. It demanded accountability. Wallace didn't blink. She didn't move. She didn't look up. The posture of polished composure that had carried her through a career of controlled conversations collapsed. Her right hand rose an inch from the desk, then lowered again. Her fingers curled inward, like they were trying to grip something no longer there. And then slowly, she bowed her head. Not in thought, not in strategy, but in quiet, irreversible defeat. No one clapped. No one whispered. No one saved her. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the moment had spoken for her, and the only sound left in that hearing room was the quiet, lingering echo of a boy who never asked to be brave, asking for something far more radical, to be left alone. And as the screen faded to black, DJ Daniel's plea still echoing through the room like a siren in the wreckage. No one could look away. The moment had passed, but its aftershock had only just begun. The silence in the chamber was no longer about restraint. It was the sound of a reputation collapsing in real time. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't gloat. She simply folded her hands. The calm architect of a reckoning that had written itself. And then, without warning, phones throughout the room began to light up. Tablets vibrated. Earbuds buzzed in the ears of aides and journalists alike. Something was happening, not in the room, but around it. A digital rupture had begun, bleeding into the world beyond Capitol Hill. A young staffer from the media pool stood suddenly, whispering frantically into his headset. Seconds later, a CNN field producer nodded to her camera operator and raised one hand into the air, signaling breaking. The screen behind Jasmine flickered to life, this time not with prepared exhibits, but with a live news chyron, hastily dropped in mid-broadcast. Breaking. Apple, Spotify remove the best people from featured podcast listings following Capitol testimony. Below it, a live ticker scrolled in red. Search visibility disabled. Promotion contracts suspended. The words came like fire over dry timber. Wallace's podcast hadn't just lost favor. It had been erased. Across the platforms where it once sat atop curated staff picks and editor's choice, it now read, "No longer available in featured rankings." And within minutes, the backlash spread further. Public forums flooded with screenshots of the removal, former subscribers voicing betrayal, influencers and critics from both political ends posting the same word, unforgivable. Wallace didn't react, not externally, but her hands, so still just minutes before, began to move. Small, nervous gestures, a twitch in her left index finger, a subtle rub of the thumbnail against her wedding ring. She was listening, she was absorbing, and the silence around her had begun to feel like isolation. Then the second shoe dropped. A White House communications staffer entered the chamber from the west door, handing a folded note to one of the senior Judiciary Committee members. The message was read, silently, before being passed to Jasmine. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't need to. The screen behind her updated once more, this time with a bold headline from Politico. White House cancels meeting with Nicolle Wallace on public trust in media, citing incompatibility of values. The subtext screamed louder than any official press release. A conversation about ethics could not include someone who had just been nationally exposed for violating them. And for Wallace, that was more than a scheduling conflict. It was exile. Her entire identity, trusted media insider, political thought partner, cultural tastemaker, was now toxic currency. Her access, once automatic, was revoked. Her proximity to influence, now a liability. The seats she once filled were going cold, but the unraveling wasn't done. From the press box, a Bloomberg journalist raised her phone, quoting a new statement just released by Arcturus Equity Group, one of the podcast's largest financial backers. Her voice trembled with the weight of the quote as she read it aloud into the room. "We invested in thought leadership. We do not fund the emotional manipulation of sick children. As of today, all support for Ms. Wallace's podcast is terminated. No spin, no ambiguity, just financial death in a single paragraph." On the screen, the official statement followed seconds later, complete with company letterhead and timestamp. The email bore the subject line, "Immediate withdrawal of partnership, irreconcilable ethical breach." Wallace's head dipped slightly, no longer defiant, no longer defensive, just lowered. She had survived thousands of interviews, hundreds of tough headlines. But not this. Not when the world outside the hearing was reacting in real time, stripping her legacy layer by layer. Her podcast was gone from the front page. Her White House access had been rescinded. Her funding had collapsed in public. And all she could do under the glow of institutional lighting, with 17 million people still watching, was sit. Not as a journalist, not as a host, not even as a victim, but as a symbol of what happens when trust is monetized, and the voice holding the mic forgets who's listening. And as the final blow landed, sponsorships revoked, meetings canceled, her podcast scrubbed from every digital storefront, the silence surrounding Nicolle Wallace had become weaponized. It wasn't the silence of suspense, it was the silence of distance, of people strategically backing away from something that could still explode. Nicolle sat rigid, eyes fixed downward, while the hearing room's collective gaze shifted from pity to calculation. But the most brutal cut, the one she never saw coming, was already loading, not through testimony or exhibits, but from the outside world. And this time, it came from inside her own house. Phones lit up again. 1, 2, then a dozen. Staffers stared. Producers on the media balcony froze mid-whisper. It wasn't a leak, nor a political statement from the Hill. It was a tweet. A single surgical tweet from Rachel Maddow. Not just a fellow MSNBC anchor, not just a respected name, but Wallace's closest ideological peer, a woman who had dined with her, defended her, co-hosted crisis night panels with her through elections, impeachments, insurrections. And now, without warning, Maddow had drawn a clean, public line in digital concrete. "I was wrong to stay silent. We cannot defend the weaponization of children for political storytelling, no matter who does it. That includes us. No hashtags, no emojis. Just truth, raw and unflinching. Like a resignation letter nailed to the front door of the cathedral they built together. Within 60 seconds, the tweet detonated across every screen in the chamber. Committee members' phones lit up in near unison. The press gallery broke into hushed chaos, half documenting, half gasping. Wallace didn't look, but the light from a nearby aide's iPad illuminated the unmistakable blue and white interface of Twitter, where her name had been trending for hours, now flanked by the phrase that would write her eulogy in media history: number MSNBC reckoning. Within 5 minutes, it was the #1 trend nationwide. Not manufactured, not algorithmically boosted, organic, relentless, viral with purpose. It wasn't just a cultural response. It was a call to audit the entire institution. Viewers who had once defended MSNBC through thick and thin now posted screenshots of their unsubscribes. Longtime liberal commentators shared the tweet with captions like, "Accountability begins at home." Even former producers chimed in, some cautiously, others defiantly. What had been a single fire had now become a coordinated demolition. And through it all, Wallace sat unmoving. She had survived political slander, false accusations, media witch hunts. But she had never survived abandonment. Not like this. Not from Rachel. Not from within. She tried to reach for the water again, missed, rested her palm on the desk instead. The veneer of control, the posture, the polish, the projection of calm was gone. She didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She didn't defend. Because what defense could outvoice the echo of that tweet? Rachel hadn't just distanced herself. She had rewritten the verdict. And in doing so, she made sure the public knew this wasn't just about one woman. It was about an entire network now forced to answer a question louder than any scandal. When the microphone is misused, how long before the silence becomes complicity? And as Rachel Maddow's words continued to ripple across every digital surface in the room, Nicolle Wallace didn't lift her head. She didn't need to. She could feel the collapse tightening around her like a vice. This time, not from political adversaries, but from the very people who once stood beside her. Hashtags she had never feared now carried her name like a guilty fingerprint. The phrase MSNBC reckoning wasn't trending, it was triumphing. And yet even then, something deeper, something more final was still on its way. Because behind the scenes in offices above this very hearing, decisions had already been made. Jasmine Crockett knew it. So did the press. But the cameras and Wallace had yet to see what was coming. Without ceremony, the lights dimmed slightly. A tone chimed through the chamber's audio system, clear, corporate, unmistakable. Then the central screen behind Jasmine flared to life again. Not with documents or evidence, but with the live face of Robert Esler, chairman of MSNBC. The framing was precise. His background, matte blue with the network's logo blurred softly behind, reflected calm control. But his expression was taut, jaw clenched like someone delivering a eulogy in a boardroom. He didn't offer pleasantries, didn't introduce himself, just looked directly into the lens and said, "After internal review and in light of today's proceedings, MSNBC is hereby terminating its long-term advisory relationship with Nicolle Wallace, effective immediately." A stunned stillness swept the room, but this time it came laced with something else. Release. No more speculation. No more internal spin. The network hadn't just distanced itself. It had cut the cord. On camera. In public. Under oath. Robert Esler continued, his tone clipped and practiced. "We acknowledge the trust our viewers place in us and understand that credibility must be earned every day. Today, that credibility requires accountability. Our decision reflects our commitment to those values." And then the feed went black. No follow-up. No chance for rebuttal. Just termination. Executed with the same precision Wallace once wielded against her guests. Before the room could recalibrate, it happened. A voice rang out. Not from the dais, not from a journalist, but from the gallery. A man in his late 50s, dressed in a faded veteran's jacket, rose to his feet. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait to be recognized. He simply stood and shouted, "That should have happened last year." Gasps followed, not because of what he said, but because of how many agreed. Heads turned. Cameras shifted. A ripple of nods moved through the gallery like a current catching dry brush. Someone in the second row clapped once. Instinctive, not performative. Then immediately stopped, aware of the gravity. But the sound had been made. The seal had been broken. Wallace sat frozen, eyes now wide but unfocused. Her body didn't react to the outburst, but her face, drained of color, jaw slightly slack, made one thing devastatingly clear. She had expected this moment eventually. She just hadn't expected it here. The attention turned to Jasmine, and she didn't miss a beat. She didn't rise. She didn't lift her voice. She simply leaned forward, eyes calm, words exact, and delivered the final blow, not in rage, but with the force of history clearing its throat. "Sometimes," she said, voice smooth like polished stone, "silence is complicity. But today, truth holds the mic." The room didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The impact didn't call for applause. It called for acknowledgement. And what Jasmine had done in that moment was more than prosecution. It was exorcism. She had taken a platform once built to tell stories and reminded the world that when it's used to exploit the voiceless, it no longer deserves to exist unchallenged. Wallace didn't lift her head again, not to respond, not to defend, because there was nothing left to say. Her mic was off. And as Jasmine Crockett's final words, "Today, truth holds the mic," echoed across the chamber like the closing line of a verdict no court could overturn, the weight of the entire hearing seemed to descend upon Nicolle Wallace's shoulders all at once. The room no longer looked at her as a commentator, a journalist, or even a political casualty. She was now something far more haunting, a monument to what happens when credibility is weaponized and conscience is outsourced. Slowly, mechanically, she gathered her papers, though there was nothing left to say, nothing left to defend. Her hands moved more out of ritual than necessity, as if completing a gesture she had performed 1,000 times on studio sets where the power was hers. But here under these lights, that familiarity had turned into futility. She stood up slowly, deliberately, and began her walk toward the exit. The cameras followed her like shadows made of glass. They didn't zoom. They hovered, smooth, clinical, unblinking, capturing not drama, but consequence. Her heels struck the marble in a rhythm that no longer sounded confident, but hollow. The exit sign glowed red at the end of the aisle, a cruel irony. The only light that offered her escape was one she didn't control. And then came the flash. Not one. Hundreds. A wall of lightning erupting as soon as she crossed the threshold of the press perimeter. Journalists didn't shout. No one barked questions. The silence had become its own kind of punishment, a rejection louder than any headline. She kept walking. Not once did she lift her head. But then, without warning, she passed him. He wasn't seated on the dais. He wasn't in a headline. He wasn't behind a microphone. He was in the aisle. DJ Daniel, the boy at the center of it all, the one whose name had been dragged across airwaves, commodified, distorted, and defended by people who never once asked him to speak. He had entered the hearing late, escorted quietly by his mother and a Capitol staffer, positioned respectfully in the second row, away from the spectacle. But now as Wallace walked past, the moment crystallized into something no scriptwriter could have staged. He stood. He didn't say a word. He didn't reach out. He simply stood, face pale but composed, and looked up at her. Not with hatred, not with victory, but with something far heavier. Disappointment. And Wallace could not meet his gaze. Her eyes flicked toward him for a breath, then fell instantly to the floor, like glass retreating from a flame. Her lips twitched, her throat tensed. But no apology came. No words at all. She moved past him like he was part of the marble. But DJ didn't sit down. Instead, with hands that trembled slightly, he reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of paper, crumpled, softened by repeated folding. Carefully, he made his way down the aisle, the room parting gently for him like the sea bowing to a deeper current. He stepped onto the carpeted incline toward the dais, where Jasmine still sat, silent, centered, watching it unfold with quiet, unspeakable gravity. When DJ reached her, he didn't speak immediately. He simply handed her the note, handwritten in blue ink, blocky and earnest. Jasmine unfolded it, reading as the cameras rolled, capturing every second. DJ's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but somehow it cut through the oxygen like a blade of sunlight through storm clouds. Thank you for fighting for kids who don't get microphones. The room didn't move. A single tear rolled down Jasmine's cheek. She didn't wipe it away, because this moment, this boy, wasn't about optics. It wasn't a segment. It wasn't a rating spike. It was the one voice that had been used, stolen, repurposed, and finally, restored. And for the first time in hours, Nicolle Wallace was no longer the focal point of the room. DJ Daniel was. And this time, he wasn't a story. He was the author. And as DJ Daniel's quiet, defiant moment with Jasmine came to an end, his note clutched tightly in her hand, his words still lingering in the air like the aftermath of a lightning strike, the room seemed to hold its breath, unsure whether to applaud or grieve. Jasmine turned back toward the dais, but she didn't sit. She stood there, hands steady, face unreadable. Then, without speaking, she gestured to the lead technician. One last clip, her eyes seemed to say. One more truth to honor before the curtain could fall. The technician nodded, and the lights dimmed for the final time. The screen behind the dais flared to life. Not in dramatic color, not with flashy graphics, but in soft, muted lighting. It was DJ Daniel again, but this time he was seated in a simple studio, framed in a way that allowed no distractions. There were no Chiron banners, no scrolling hashtags, no performance polish. Just a boy, a survivor, a human being stripped of media packaging. His hoodie was zipped up halfway, his eyes clear and unwavering. There were visible bandage marks at the bend of one arm, where an IV had likely sat. His voice, when he began, was quiet, quieter than the previous clip. But what it lacked in volume, it carried in moral gravity. She thought I was a gimmick, DJ said, not with spite, but with an exhaustion deeper than most adults would understand. But I'm a real person. I have doctors, I have scars, I have bad days. Some days I can't walk without help. Some nights I throw up for hours after treatment. He paused, eyes blinking slowly. But I still try to go to school. I still read comic books. I still laugh when my dog jumps on the couch, even when he's not supposed to. I'm not a message, he continued. I'm not a segment. I'm not a number on a chart or a way to win an argument. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in truth. I'm just trying to live. Then came the final line, the one that would sear itself into the country's conscience. Thank you, Congress, for proving that I'm not a thing, I'm a someone. The screen went black, not a fade, not a transition, just an abrupt, surgical stop, like the closing of a book that no one realized was nonfiction until the last page. The silence that followed wasn't stunned, it was stricken. Even the most cynical reporters in the press box sat with their heads lowered, thumbs still, phones forgotten. The collective weight of what had just been said, and who had said it, made even the room's marble columns seem suddenly fragile. Nicolle Wallace, seated now in the far corner, didn't shift. She didn't raise her head. She didn't cry, but she seemed smaller. Not just defeated, dismantled. And then the outside world responded. Within 60 seconds of the clip ending, DJ Daniel's name was the #1 trending topic across every major social platform. But it wasn't just his name. Hashtags like #not a gimmick, #I am someone, and #truth has the mic ignited a wildfire across the digital landscape. The original video was posted to the official congressional streaming channel and reshared 3.2 million times in under 5 hours. On YouTube, the raw clip, without commentary, without overlays, gained 10 million views by nightfall. On TikTok, teens and veterans alike lip-synced to DJ's words. She thought I was a gimmick, was mouthed against grainy emotional montages. But the digital fallout didn't stop at trending topics. It became consequence. By the following morning, Nicolle Wallace had lost 1.2 million followers across Twitter, Instagram, and her podcast mailing list. By the 72-hour mark, that number had climbed to nearly 2 million, and that didn't include silent unsubs or the mass deletion of engagement from thousands who had once praised her as a truth teller. Verified users began unfollowing publicly, some with comments like, "I believed her," Now I believe him. Even former guests on The Best People began issuing statements, distancing themselves from what had become a cultural reckoning in real time. Major platforms didn't wait to issue their response. Apple removed The Best People from their editors' picks and inspiration categories. Spotify delisted the show from both social justice and top political commentary. By the end of the week, the podcast, once a flagship of modern media activism, had disappeared from all algorithm-based homepage recommendations. Search functionality still worked, but only if you knew exactly what to look for. The silence was strategic. The erasure was deliberate. Media watchdog groups pounced. So did professors, students, and journalism guilds. DJ Daniels' clip was shown in freshman media ethics classes within 24 hours. Universities streamed the hearing replay in full. News programs, liberal and conservative alike, ran split-screen commentary, not debating if Wallace had gone too far, but asking how the industry let it happen at all. For Wallace, it was a collapse no PR team could reverse. But for the nation, it was something bigger. Because what had begun as a hearing about one voice had become a referendum on all of them. A searing, unfiltered confrontation between access and abuse, between influence and accountability. And in the wreckage of it all, one truth stood. This wasn't just about Nicolle Wallace. It was about every institution that had forgotten what power was supposed to be for. It was about the journalists who had once promised to speak truth to power and had instead spoken on behalf of it, until that very truth came for them. It was about the producers, the bookers, the strategists, the panels who viewed human suffering as narrative fuel and trauma as leverage. It was about a boy who had fought to survive something that could kill him, and then had to survive being reduced to a rhetorical device on national television. It was about the microphone and who gets to hold it. And on that day, for the first time in a very long time, the microphone belonged not to power, but to someone it had once tried to erase. DJ Daniel, not a prop, not a pawn, a person, a survivor, a symbol, not of victimhood, but of vindication. And that hearing, once thought to be just another political spectacle, had become something else entirely, a national reckoning, not with politics, not with partisanship, but with the very question that echoed louder than any headline. If the press is free but unaccountable, what exactly is it free to do? And America answered, by listening. And as the echo of DJ Daniels' final words faded from millions of screens, what lingered wasn't silence, it was shame. Not the loud performative kind that fades when cameras cut, but the raw, aching realization of a nation forced to re-examine the stories it tells and the pain it profits from. This wasn't a political victory. There were no applause breaks, no confetti, just the deep collective stillness that comes when people finally see the cost of their indifference. And from that stillness, a reckoning began, not in courtrooms, not in studios, but in the conscience of a country. That was the moment Jasmine Crockett walked alone down the marble corridor, the hearing now behind her, the echoes of exposed truths still trailing in her wake. Her heels clicked, but not like a victor's, like someone carrying weight she didn't ask for. Journalists tried to speak to her. Cameramen flinched, unsure if they were capturing redemption or tragedy. She said nothing. The paper DJ gave her was folded in her palm, her grip tightening every time another flashbulb exploded in her face. To some, this was justice, but to her, it was heartbreak wearing the mask of accountability. And maybe that's what made it matter, because in the weeks that followed, people didn't just talk about the scandal. They talked about the boy. They talked about the system that let his name be weaponized, about the silence that followed when it should have been rage, and about the line that had quietly been crossed in American media, where the truth wasn't something you earned, but something you edited. Across campuses, professors asked new questions. What does freedom of the press mean when it shields cruelty? Who holds the microphone, and who gets cut in post-production? In hospitals, young cancer patients were shown the clip of DJ Daniel not to inspire pity, but to teach resilience. He didn't just survive, one doctor told a class of interns. He reminded the world why some stories should never be treated as strategy. And in newsrooms, those temples of curated objectivity, reporters stared longer at their scripts. They paused before reducing someone to a label. Whisper networks emerged, quietly exposing other anchors, producers, hosts who had used pain as currency and children as spectacle. For every Wallace, there were others. Jasmine hadn't lit the match. She had simply refused to look away once the fire started. The deeper lesson, though, came not from Congress or commentary. It came from DJ himself, the boy who wasn't supposed to speak, the child some believed was too sick, too young, too uninformed to understand media manipulation. And yet it was his voice, steady, small, unflinching, that cut through America's noise like a scalpel. I'm not a message, I'm a someone. That single sentence now hung in classrooms. It appeared in national editorials. It was spray-painted on walls and quoted at rallies, not as a viral moment, but as a reminder. When we use children to fight ideological battles, we don't win. We fracture what's sacred. Still, not everyone learned. A popular cable panel tried to run a counter-segment, painting Jasmine as overly emotional and accusing her of using DJ as a prop herself. But within minutes, viewers turned off.